Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our viewers from Fiji to Turkey of the Asia Pacific region and beyond. My name is Jose, and to our viewers, thank you very much for tuning in today to our Productivity Talk of the Asia Pacific region organized by the Asian Productivity Organization or the APO. Thank you very much for our viewers. Today's topic is on insights on public sector productivity. And please let me share to our viewers that the APO has undertaken various capacity building initiatives for the public sector in APO members to enhance its productivity. But what do we really mean by public sector productivity? In the private sector, for instance, it is much easier to determine productivity. It is just the measurement of output from input. But is it the same for the public sector? Since the main function of the government is to improve citizens' welfare, that is primarily defined in terms of satisfaction, as an example. In other cases, the services of the public sector are being offered for free or in subsidized manner. So today we will shed some insights on this issue, including the basic concepts and approaches of measuring public sector productivity. Let me share to you that the APO has conducted two research works and published this last year and the last 3 years, which are measuring public sector productivity in selected Asian countries. That was published in 2016. That look into the productivity of government agencies involved with driver's licensing, tax collection, and passport processing. Another research was carried out and published in 2019 that was productivity in welfare service delivery that looked into the productivity performance of two important public services, which are health and education sectors. So today we hope to share some insights about this publication on productivity performance of health and education sectors of APO members. So joining us in this P Talk, please allow me to introduce our two speakers. First, Ms. Magdalena Mendoza, who is a Senior Vice President from the Development Academy of the Philippines, the National Productivity Organization of the Philippines, who earned her master's degree from the National University of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and one of the leading experts from the Philippines in the field of public sector productivity. She also has contributed to the APO publications on this topic. So despite the ongoing typhoon situation in the country, Ms. Mendoza is joining us. Hello, ma'am. Good afternoon.
Yeah,
So
good
I hope,
afternoon to APO and to our viewers. Yeah, it is a stormy day in Manila. I hope I can be with you given the situation throughout this week.
so thank you very much. And we understand your situation there. So our prayers to you in Manila, especially the people in Manila who are this in bad weather situation. And joining us also is Mr. Dean Parham, who was an assistant commissioner in the Australian Productivity Commission, a specialist advisor in the Australian Treasury, and now a research visitor at the Crawford School of Public Policy, Australian National University. He was also the designated chief expert of the APO research on productivity in welfare service delivery. Good afternoon, Mr. Parham.
Good afternoon, everybody. Very good to be with you.
Thank you very much for joining us today. So we would like to start our session with a presentation of Ms. Mendoza. So we'd like to encourage our viewers to send your questions and comments in the chat corner for our guest experts to answer during the Q&A session time later. So Ms. Mendoza, your presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Jose. My topic is some insights on productivity. And if you look at the outline, next slide, please. I have 4 points to share to you this afternoon. Next slide, please. So the first one is productivity still relevant? What do we mean by public sector productivity? How the productivity movement in the public sector evolved? And what is the new thinking on productivity in the public sector? So please go to the next slide. Is productivity still relevant? Of course, I believe that productivity is very relevant and important goal in the public sector for the following reasons. Firstly, the public sector is the main consumer of public services. Public expenditure ranges from about 10% to at most 40% of the GDP, and this is mostly tax money. The public sector is expected to use these resources prudently. The second reason is that the public sector is one of the big employers, if not the biggest employer in the economy. It must ensure, therefore, high productivity from public servants. The third reason is that the public sector is a key provider of the basic services in developing economies, such as the most members of APO. Public sector provides education, health, social welfare, defense, security, and vital infrastructure. And public sector must deliver these goods and services to support societal productivity in the most efficient, economical, ethical, and effective manner. In the next slide, you will see the size and scope of the public sector. In terms of public sector employment, we can see that the proportion of public sector employees to total employment ranges between 3 to 4% to 25%. On the average for APO member countries, it is between 8% to 17%, and developed countries like the US, USA, and Canada have around 21 to 25%. In terms of scope, the public sector has the big share of the GDP. Total government expenditure to GDP ranges from roughly 25% of the GDP for most of APO member economies to over 30% of the GDP for more developed ones. This means that the public sector has at its disposal a sizable amount of resources, which come mainly from tax money. For these reasons, I argue that productivity, especially the manner by which public resources are used to produce the vital public services, is very important in the public sector. Please go to the next slide. With the current pandemic, productivity becomes even more important. The pandemic brought havoc to our society and negatively affected almost all economic activities. Never in history that the public sector is called to channel so much resources to deal with this health event and mitigate the effects of the pandemic on the citizens, the businesses, and the country as a whole. With the looming recession, which means government can expect less revenues, and the continuing uncertainties, such as when the vaccine could be available, or once available, if it would effectively prevent further infections, government is faced with serious constraints. The public sector must deliver all essential services, given tighter budget and scarce public resources, while capacitating itself to operate under the new normal in the context of an increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. Please go to the next slide so we can define public sector productivity. There are actually many definitions, but there is no consensus. When used in the public sector, productivity indicates how efficiently public resources are employed in providing public services. The mantra is doing more with less. It also means producing quality results or quality policies and services. A productive organization is one that produces high-quality outputs at first instance, where resources are not wasted due to rework. The public sector productivity is also about restoring public trust. The productivity field provides the means to strengthen the confidence in the government by giving the public its money's worth in terms of efficient and effective services, and by operating on the basis of a genuine work ethic and keener sense of public accountability. Public sector productivity is also synonymous to controlling corruption, as I will explain later, and good governance. In a broader sense, we view public sector productivity as a means of enhancing effectiveness of the public sector in creating a conducive environment to increase total factor productivity in private sector production and ensure quality governance. But I'd like to sum it all through this. Productivity in the public sector means doing the right things. That is the purpose of the organization. Even if no one is watching, that is ethics. And doing things right at the right time, at the right place, and at the right cost. That means achieving the purpose of the organization to meet the needs of the citizens. This is the sworn duty of those in the public sector. Next slide, please. So here you will see that using the definition of public sector productivity as the ratio of government outputs to government inputs, we can see various strategies to improve productivity performance. Firstly, doing more with the same, or doing more with less, or maybe doing more with much more, or doing less with much less. At any rate, there are many strategies. So let us now discuss related concepts to public sector productivity. Next slide, please. For instance, productivity and corruption. Corruption is a big issue in the public sector, whether it is actually happening or may be perceived only. Productivity is inversely related to corruption. The consequence of corruption is low public sector productivity. We can also say that low productivity is symptomatic of corruption. The early productivity movement in the public sector evolved from a simple moral concern to improve government by eradicating corruption. This is based on the thinking that eliminating corruption was the first step in attaining government efficiency and effectiveness. And accordingly, if governments were grossly inefficient and ineffective, then these governments were likely corrupt as well. Likewise, if a program's productivity is low, the program is ill-conceived, unworkable, or poorly managed, it is also likely that the program has been corrupted. Another related concept is ethics. Please go to the next slide. Ethics and productivity intersect. Productivity is about doing things right, and doing things right is also associated with efficiency. While effectiveness is about doing the right things, and when doing both, even if no one is watching, this is called ethics. Productivity and ethics are reciprocally integral to the success of a public sector organization. Doing the right things, as mentioned earlier, is the purpose of an organization, and doing things right is the means to achieve that purpose. Now, we go to the evolution of public sector productivity. Please go to the next slide. According to some experts, a Dutch expert, Gert Bockert, who has made studies to measure productivity, we can relate the history of productivity movements in the public sector to the phases in prevailing models of public management. The first phase was government by the efficient from 1990 to 1940, when the important distinction between political and administrative roles and efficiency in the public sector relied mostly on scientific management popularized by Frederick Taylor. From 1940 to 1970, it was characterized as government by administrators, and the productivity movement is marked by strong focus on control of public expenditure. The third phase is government by managers or managerialism, which is emphasizing the synthesis of these two movements, but focus on getting more value from taxpayers' money. From 1980 to around 2000, it was government by the private sector, and productivity is enhanced by actually transferring some public sector activities and responsibility to the private sector, or failing that by restructuring the public sector in ways that stimulate public managers to operate as though they were in the private sector. From the previous phase emerged the conceptualization of public sector productivity corresponding to public value approach to governance and management. And related to this is the emphasis on ethics of public service and public trust. In recent years, the reform movement focused on these 5 key themes to achieve a government that costs less, a quality government, a smart government, a digital government, and an honest government where ethics, integrity, transparency, and accountability are non-negotiable. Next slide, please. On the part of the APO, the productivity movement in the public sector had its roots in 1980s, and this was revitalized in 2009. The APO has discussed the status of public sector modernization, and proposals for public sector productivity in view of the growing recognition of the important role of public sector organizations in the attainment of national development and competitiveness. And given that most of the NPOs see the value of having time-tested private sector productivity and quality concepts reintroduced and adapted to the public sector. The APO developed the Public Sector Productivity Program Framework, which addresses vital elements that we should consider as most urgent and relevant to enhance productivity of public sector organizations in the Asia-Pacific region. There are 5 thematic areas, and these include service quality, e-government, innovation leadership, smart regulation, and citizen-centered services. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, within this framework, we also tackle organizational productivity. Organizational productivity is the capacity of public sector organization to produce the results expected of them using, in the best effort, the resources of the public. The universe of established public techniques for improving organizational productivity is large and varied, and they fall traditionally into these 3 or rather 5 groups. First one is techniques to change work processes, as well as the adoption of new technologies to achieve higher efficiency, such as automation and digitization. Second is maximizing productivity contribution of human resources, especially the knowledge they possess about their work through productivity incentives, competency development, and employee engagement. Thirdly is optimizing the utilization of physical resources, that is facilities, equipment, and materials, by eliminating loss and waste and ensuring overall equipment effectiveness. The fourth one is adopting new managerial approaches, for instance, managing for quality, managing for building partnerships, and aiming for seamless operations and agility in performance. And the last one is harnessing information and knowledge to create new and value-adding policies and services. Next slide, please. The APO has recently published the Manual on Public Sector Productivity to assist public sector organizations to implement incremental improvements and innovate to achieve cost effectiveness, competitiveness, citizen satisfaction, public trust, and ultimately the citizens' quality of life. There are 11 modules here elaborating on the house of leading innovations for productivity. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. So now I go to the 4th part of my talk. Is there a new thinking on public sector productivity? Of course, despite the importance of productivity, there is lingering question on its relevance. And some people argue that productivity is already obsolete and that instead of productivity, we must set eyes on other things: innovation, agility, strategic foresight, future readiness, and the like. The APO has charted its Vision 2025 with these developments in mind. We in the productivity movement believe that achieving high productivity is even more important these days, although the current, emerging, and future challenges call for innovative productivity and agile response from the private, or both private and public sectors. Next slide, please. You would see here, the OECD recently revived the productivity movement, and they argue that boosting productivity is not so much about working harder as working smarter. And it requires producing more output by better combining inputs based on new ideas, technological breakthroughs, and business models. So under the new thinking on productivity, as the Secretary General of the APO mentioned during the last meeting of the NPO heads, he said that productivity should now be part of the new lifestyle or the new work style or the new business style. Next slide, please. Okay. I also read some thoughts of the shape of things to come in the post-pandemic world. And what I would just like to highlight from this article by Nicholas Eberstadt is that the creative destruction that is being caused by the pandemic will actually provide opportunities, no, and require actually more innovation and dynamic improvements in productivity, both in the public and the private sectors. Next slide, please. So nevertheless, the new thinking on public management and governance redefines the scope of public sector productivity as an ecosystem that consists of people, processes, and institutional structures to produce core government products in the form of policy and service. To improve public sector productivity requires the rethinking of the entire system and also the introduction of innovation in all parts of the system. We need to introduce innovations in providing government inputs or the inputs themselves, innovation in the processes and institutional structure, innovation in developing people, and innovation in conceptualizing government outputs. Next slide, please. So here in the paper of Dunleavy and Pereira on growing productivity in the public sector, they illustrate the close connection between productivity and the adoption of innovations inside the public sector organization. And he said that just as technological change has been a strong and vital driver of productivity improvements in private firms, we can expect that innovations could boost public sector productivity in many ways. One way could be improving the conversion of inputs into outputs for established activities, for example, by reducing the staff numbers needed to accomplish a particular task with the use of digitization or automation, introducing new inputs into the production of established outputs, such as with the successive waves of back office computer automation of record keeping, improving productivity using qualitatively new outputs or innovative outputs. For instance, developing network automatic cameras on roads to catch speeding motorists, and nowadays developing many apps so that government can transact with government entities remotely. And lastly, introducing new outputs, for instance, such as creating electronic forms and many other ways of electronic transactions that are simpler and quicker for people to follow. So, going to the next slide, please. The call for public sector is that it must deliver all essential services given tighter budget and scarce public resources, while capacitating itself to operate under the new normal in the context of an increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. The Agile Scrum is one of the leading approaches. The public sector needs to innovate, co-create solutions with the citizens and other stakeholders, but do like the Agile Scrum, sharing knowledge on the ongoing process and innovating almost all activities in the organization. So to conclude, next slide, please. Given its role, is it still relevant? Of course, given its role, the size and scope of public sector, productivity is very relevant. And at this point, with the pandemic, it becomes even more important. Secondly, what is productivity in the public sector? Let me summarize. It is doing the right thing, even if no one is watching, and doing it right at the right time, at the right place, and at the right cost. And it is also about quality governance. Thirdly, what is the movement? What is the cost? The cost is towards having a government that costs less, a government that is quality, a government that is digital, a government that is smart, and a government that is honest. So let me end by saying that the public sector must all deliver these essential services. And the only way it can do that is to introduce innovation, hence the new notion of innovative productivity in the public sector. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mendoza, for discussing with us, bringing our attention to what is really meant by public sector productivity. And I think you highlighted very well the common understanding, which if I were to quote again, as you mentioned, it is doing the right things, even if no one is watching, and doing things right at the right time, at the right place, and at the right cost in order to meet the needs of the citizens. So I think that is a very good foundation understanding of public sector productivity. And you also have discussed with us about the evolution of how public sector productivity came into existence. And I like your presentation when you brought us to the new thinking about public sector productivity. And I think that is also the challenge for us working in the field of public sector productivity on given the current situation, how do we improve or enhance public sector productivity, and you highlighted the importance of innovation as an example. So to give us a better picture of what is really meant by public sector productivity when we look at government services, so we would like to invite Mr. Parham to show to us the study they conducted 2 years ago, then the publication was released last year in the area of, on the subject of education and health sectors, so especially those being provided by the government. So we want to understand how this concept of public sector productivity is being applied by government agencies. So Mr. Parham will take us into that understanding on what is public sector productivity when we look at the services of government agencies. So Mr. Parham, please.
Thank you very much, Jose. And yes, I would like to give a brief overview of a practical exercise to measure productivity in the area of health and education. And I guess the messages that I would like to convey is that I think this is a worthwhile exercise. It's a worthwhile thing to do. However, we found some gaps in data, and it would be worthwhile to fill those gaps, and I think that can be done relatively easily. And I suppose the third thing would be that I think this is best done by an individual government agency in-house. To do an international type exercise was perhaps a little bit ambitious. So now, are we getting my slides? Is that... there we go. So the background to this was a study commissioned by the Asian Productivity Organisation, and it was about the public provision of hospital and education services. The private sector was excluded. We were fortunate enough to have participation from 8 countries, full participation going through the actual measurement of productivity in the case of India, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. Iran, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka were initially involved, but found that they just could not access the data required and had to pull out of the exercise. And the way it was structured was that the country experts undertook analysis for their own country. And it was according to a common framework that was put in place, so that was meant to enhance the potential for comparability, pardon me, between countries. But as I say, data difficulties really meant that there were some problems with international comparisons. The report was published by the APO, as Jose mentioned, Productivity and Welfare Service Delivery, Measuring Productivity in Health and Education, and an exploratory study. I mean, I would emphasise exploratory study of selected APO countries. And there's the link there if people wish to read it. There are 3 objectives in the study: to identify, as far as possible, and assemble key indicators to measure public sector productivity in health and education, identify gaps in data and make recommendations for future collections, and as far as possible, identify the influence of factors on the productivity trends, including policy factors. It was very much a pragmatic exercise. We knew there were going to be data challenges, but the motivation behind the exercise really was to make a start and identify where the real data problems lay, and then that would provide a platform to build in improvements over time if there was the possibility to initiate new data collections, for example. Nevertheless, in the meantime, even without the best data, it would stimulate a productivity focus and a productivity mindset. Start agencies thinking about what are their outputs, what are their inputs, and what are they trying to do, and so on. So the starting point is the simple definition of productivity as outputs produced to the ratio of outputs produced to inputs used. And I'd like to add another phrase to the ones that Ms. Mendoza put forward. And productivity can be about getting more from what you have got or from what you use. And I think in the public sector case, it's really about getting more value from what you have, from your budgets. That would be the way I would emphasise it. 2 productivity measures: labour productivity, the ratio of output to labour used, and a multi-factor productivity measure, the ratio of output from all inputs used. So that's your labour, your capital, and your intermediates. And I'll mention what these different measures are in a moment. So for outputs, we have to start thinking, well, what is the value that is created? And, you know, in the case of hospitals, it's better health. But what's a measurable way of getting a sense of the size and scale of the services provided? And that's an easy measure is the number of patients or the number of treatments. And there's an implicit assumption that equal amount of service is provided to each patient. Well, that's not a very good assumption in relation to differentiating inpatient treatment from outpatient treatment. Inpatient treatment is a lot more costly and a lot more services, specialist services provided than in the case of outpatients. And so if we could separate those two, which we're able to do in some cases at least, we would get a better overall output measure. We should really go a step further and adjust the number of patients for the complexity of the service provided. And there are exercises to group different ailments and their treatment into fairly consistent or homogeneous groups. And this is the diagnostic related group. That would be a much better way in which to adjust the number of patients. But in the time available, we could not access that kind of data. But it certainly does exist for a lot of countries. On the schools side, we use the number of students. And here, the implicit assumption that the same education service is provided to each student is not so bad. But there are big differences between primary, secondary, and upper secondary, and that's a distinction that was made in measuring overall outputs. Inputs, labour, the number of hours worked, number of workers, where we include everybody, including administrative and frontline workers. Capital is the use of assets such as buildings, machinery, equipment, vehicles, and so on. The best information is often not readily available, like in published data. So we used as a measure of the scale of capital input, in the case of schools, the number of classrooms, and hospitals, the number of beds. But this is one area in which I think there could be some improvements made in the data without a great deal of effort. And finally, purchase of intermediates. Intermediates are expense items, things that are used up as you go, be that all the supplies or things that are bought in, components and energy and cleaning services and so on. And very often in public sector, we've got that information. That's one of the easiest to get. We also need expenditures, the amount that is spent on labour capital intermediates. There's an exercise to aggregate the growth in labour and capital and intermediates that needs the relative costs of labour, capital and intermediates. And that's where we've got a difficulty in getting capital costs in particular. Again, we need some better information on that. I just wanted to, because I'm going to show you the estimates of multi-factor productivity and not labour productivity. Labour productivity is perhaps the easiest one to measure because it's just the ratio of output to number of employees. But there is a problem if there is more contracting out of a service. And let's think of cleaning as a simple example. If that was done by employees of the agency, but then is shifted out to another organisation who then provide that cleaning service, well, then we've got the outputs about the same. Our use of labour is less, but our intermediates, which cover purchases of services, is more. And so the ratio of output to labour is going to increase. We're going to have a jump in labour productivity, but that's not necessarily an indication of greater efficiency. So in that case, it's best to use multi-factor productivity. And if you can't get a capital measure or a good capital measure, then have a combined labour and intermediates measure so that you can get that trade-off between labour and intermediates. So here are our results. In the hospitals, we can see that Malaysian productivity increased, but generally speaking, there's been a decline in multi-factor productivity, both in hospitals and schools. And that's a bit surprising. You could assume fairly flat productivity. That might be understandable, but a decline of quite a considerable decline of, sort of 20% or so is difficult to understand. So we have to interpret this in the following way. The governments have been devoting a lot more resources to improving community access to services, to hospitals and schools, and to improving the quality of services. And so, for example, reducing the student-teacher ratios and so on. So that shows up in input measures, increases in inputs, but not necessarily in terms of output measures. And so we're getting this decline in productivity. And therefore, it underlines the importance of viewing these productivity measures in a much more general well-being or welfare framework, where productivity is one important consideration, but it's not everything. And this takes us back to a conceptual framework that we should really start with, and the one that Ms. Mendoza talked to, where inputs lead to outputs, which is productivity, and outputs deliver outcomes. And it's the changes in outcomes that that define value and improvements in quality of these outputs. But importantly, we've got to start from objectives. What is the organisation really trying to do here? So in the case of schools, one of the objectives was to improve access to education. And so that defines the outcomes that we're looking for and the quality indicators that we're looking for to sit alongside the technical measure of productivity. So if we had those kinds of measures, we would see, well, as a result of that decline in productivity, did we see any decline or increase in the quality of service, the quality of outputs, and did we see any increase in outcomes? Okay. So the two types of quality indicators, the output quality or the quality of service, that could be things like indicators of waiting times, adverse offence readmission rates, or in schools, participation rates of at-age children and their retention rates through the year. And outcome indicators, the effects that it has on outcomes, might be improved quality of life or customer satisfaction, and improved literacy and better employment prospects. So these are the sorts of indicators that should go alongside the productivity indicators. I don't advocate trying to combine them and adjust the productivity numbers for changes in quality, but they should go alongside. So in conclusion, I'd say this kind of exercise can be useful if valued as a pathway to improve measures and feedback over time. It identifies key areas for improvement. It establishes a mindset and a framework for reviewing performance. I mean, I think that mindset is to put everything in a value framework. What is the value that we're trying to create? What is the organisation actually trying to do, and what's its value? What value is it trying to create? And I think we can get something useful out of them, even with some rudimentary measures, but we need some more data and need to consider quality measures alongside these productivity measures. And it's very important to consult with stakeholders in developing these quality measures. The whole exercise has to be credible to people outside the organisation. All right, thank you very much. That's all I wanted to say, and I'll hand back to you, Jose.
Thank you very much, Dean, for a very insightful presentation about your research. So let me start the discussion bridging on what was explained by Ms. Mendoza in terms of understanding public sector productivity and your research work. Before I go to the questions here, let me just put first one very good context that we are all in now. So I think Ms. Mendoza's slides, one of her slides mentioned about the relevance of public sector productivity, and especially in this COVID-19. Okay, I think people right now are preoccupied with this pandemic, and maybe the first thing they ask is how relevant or what impact or what benefit citizens will get if public sector is productive or effective or efficient. So my first question is this public sector productivity very relevant at this point in time? I mean, I think Ms. Mendoza mentioned that in her slide, but can you share to us how is it relevant? And then maybe in the next questions I will ask, we'll talk more about the relevance of productivity in the public sector. So let me just put first in that context. So like pandemic means, I would say that maybe some government services are being reformed, or maybe temporarily stopped, or maybe being reviewed because of the new normal. So my question is, how can we ensure that productivity will still be there in the public sector in the present time or in the new normal? Do you have your own views? Maybe Dean, Mr. Farhan, please.
Yes. I think as Ms. Mendoza said, it's a time in which productivity is very, very important because governments are having to outlay a lot more money to support people and to support businesses and a lot of welfare payments and so on. Now, a lot of that's had to happen very quickly. And we would hope that that was being done effectively and meeting the needs of people and businesses and households. But as time has gone on, there have been adjustments made to these measures as governments have learnt more. And so, in a sense, we're getting a little bit more value for money as we go. But I think the danger is if we don't think about it, don't think of productivity and value for money and effectiveness, with all this money that is flowing out from governments, that a lot of it will be potentially wasted. So productivity, I think, is extremely important in this context to making sure that we're getting the best value, which is the best change in outcomes that we possibly can.
Thank you very much for your insight on the question, Mr. Parham. About Ms. Mendoza, any insight on the question on the importance and relevance of public sector productivity in the present time, in the new normal?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned to you earlier, nowadays, because we are in the midst of a crisis, and there is some sort of recession in the economy, government is experiencing very tight financial or fiscal situation, and they need to make good use of all the available public resources to help people and also to continue to provide the services. And nowadays, because of the health protocols, we need to ensure that it's not just efficient, it is not just effective, but it is also very, very safe. So government now, for instance, in my country, is mandated to provide contactless services. And even if we are in very tight community quarantines, businesses of government must continue. No? And on top of that, government has to realign its budget so that it can provide direct financial assistance to the affected sectors, not just the traditional, I would say, poorer segments, but even assistance to businesses, particularly the medium enterprises and the labor sector that were gainfully employed before the pandemic. So with that very tight financial situation in government, and with the requirement that it continue to provide the vital services to the public, I think productivity becomes even more important, and therefore it has to be innovative productivity. Government has to innovate in almost all of its activities.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Okay, let me proceed to the question. I think this relates to Mr. Parham's presentation, but of course, Ms. Mendoza can also comment. So Ms. Mendoza defined one of her definitions, or I would say explanation about public sector productivity is about doing the right thing, even if no one is watching, and doing the things right at the right time, at the right place, at the right cost in order to meet citizens' expectations. So my question is in relation to the study conducted, or in particular with the health and education sectors. So what are the expected gains, for example, if the public sector is efficient and effective in the service delivery, Mr. Parham? Because your presentation, your research studied about productivity performance, but at the outset, so if the public sector is indeed productive or effective and efficient, so what are the expected gains or benefits to the citizens, in this particular case, the health and education sectors?
Yes. No,
Would you
that's
like to share?
a extremely important question. And unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for it because in the time that we had available, we had to do a very quick exercise that was based on the data that was readily available and published. And so the sorts of quality indicators that we looked at were very general. So looking at life expectancy or looking at literacy rates and so on. So we didn't have time to do the full-blown exercise. And that full-blown exercise, as I was saying, it starts from what are your objectives? What's the objective of this organisation or this program? And so you really have to sit down and nut out what is the education program seeking to achieve, and what is the hospitals program seeking to achieve, and then you would get some indicators. And so, you know, it might be like if we're looking at improved access to schools, then what is the participation rate of students in different age groups? Or if we're looking at regions, you know, what's the participation rate of students in rural schools and the rural communities, and get some indicators on those. And then we would be able to relate productivity to success or otherwise in achieving better outcomes and achieving our objectives. So the answer to your question is really it as an initial step in the exercise. Whoever's doing it has to start with talking to the organisation or the agency or whatever it is. What are your objectives? What do you want to do? And then get some indicators that will tell us whether they're actually achieving those objectives or not.
Thank you very much. Ms. Mendoza, would you like to share your insight on this? What are the benefits?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Can you hear?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, so
Okay.
can you hear me? I think if we get very efficient, effective, and economical, ethical services from the government, it will restore the public confidence in the public sector because they will realize that government or the public sector is utilizing wisely, prudently, the taxpayers' money, but at the same time, they are getting the essential public services, and that is very, very important. So it benefits the people directly, but it also benefits those in power because people will have trust in them that they are accountable and that they are responsible in the use of public resources.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me go to one of the slides of Ms. Mendoza where she mentioned about the new thinking of public sector productivity, and it shows about outcome, okay? The importance of outcome. And I think Mr. Parham also mentioned that. So my question is, can we attribute productivity performance to outcome later? And in the case of the education and health sector, how do we determine outcome and how do we relate this outcome to productivity? Would that be possible? So that is my question. I mean, using the framework on the new thinking of public sector productivity, how do we attribute productivity performance to outcome? And in that particular study on health and education sectors, how do we connect what outcome we can determine and we can connect to productivity of that particular sectors. So maybe I'd like to start with Ms. Mendoza. Connecting productivity and outcome later. Is there a connection?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the more recent proposal, especially from the OECD side, is to measure productivity in terms of the ratio of the program outcomes to the inputs used by government. And so, therefore, the health outcomes or education outcomes vis-a-vis the inputs provided by government to produce that outcome, could also be considered productivity, and therefore there is connection. And as you ask, there could be attribution. I think we are looking now at the productivity at the program outcome level, because it could be possible that the same program outcome can be produced by a public sector organization with lesser inputs and by having quality or innovative processes.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Parham, what is your take on this, especially when we look at the health and education sector?
Yes. Well, I think that the thing is, it is important to try and link productivity performance to outcomes. So in the case that I went through, we observed that there was a decline in productivity. And in order to interpret that and to say, is that really a very bad thing, or is it understandable? Well, then we have to look at outcomes, and what were the changes in outcomes as a result of the education system activities, the public sector activities, and the public sector hospital activities. So again, we need those outcome indicators that are related to our objectives, what we want to achieve, and that will tell us, well, okay, we had a decline in productivity, but and let's say we had a decline of productivity of 10%, but we had an increase in our participation of rural students of 10%. How do they weigh up? Are we prepared to accept that 10% loss of productivity if we got that much increase in participation? So yeah, we can and should attribute productivity outcomes, productivity results to outcome indicators.
Thank you very much. So I also would like to encourage Ms. Mendoza, if you have question to Mr. Parham, you may also ask, and so with Mr. Parham, if you have question to Ms. Mendoza, you are free to ask question. Okay. So let me just proceed to one more question. I think for our viewers to understand better, because I think at least in my understanding, public sector productivity is not easy to understand. I think I mentioned in the introduction that because citizens expect the service to be free and so subsidized, and it's about their welfare. Unlike in the private sector, it's just measuring the output from the input. So for example, in health, okay, or even in education in this particular sector. So I think in one of your slides, Mr. Parham, you mentioned about the quality indicators. So quality indicators means access, okay? So how much is access, or what is the accessibility of the service to the citizens? And then you're about service intensity, okay, and the quality of service, okay? So how do we gauge productivity when we look at these indicators or quality indicators? Because quality indicators may mean more resources, but you come up with the quality service, but maybe less. This is just my assumption. Mr. Parham could elaborate better this this connection we have about access, service intensity, and quality of service when we relate to productivity later. So could you please elaborate on this, for example, like in health, for example, in education, for example?
Yes, so the sort of access indicators that I had in mind, were that schooling may be, particularly secondary schooling, may be difficult for a lot of young people to engage in for a number of reasons. It might be distance, it might be that they have to go out and earn a living and support their families, all sorts of things. So access and in the health case, access again may be that it's too expensive, too many difficulties getting travelling the distance to health centres and so on. And so a lot of people are denied the services in health and education, that we would like them to have. And on service intensity, the sorts of things I had in mind was that you provide more services to each person. So, for example, in the health education case, if you reduce the size of classrooms, so increase or decrease the student-teacher ratio, then that's a way of increasing the service intensity that per student, if you like. So again, if we just looked at productivity measures as number of students or number of patients treated, that may not change all that much, but the inputs that are used would change. We'd have an increase in the number of teachers, or we might have increase in the number of hospitals. So our productivity measures are going to decline. So we really want two things. We want to judge whether the quality of service has declined or increased. And if we're providing a more intensive service, like providing more teacher services per student, we'd say the quality of service has increased, and that should be something that we take into account alongside the productivity measures. And then secondly, the other type of quality measure is the quality of outcomes. What are the changes in the outcome indicators? And they're the two things that we should take into account alongside the straight productivity measures.
Thank you very much. Ms. Mendoza, do you have any ideas or thoughts about that question? The quality indicators, such as access, service intensity, and quality service that will contribute to outcome later. So because as Mr. Parham mentioned, that more resources spent in...
I think, I think as I mentioned earlier, one of the concepts of public sector productivity is being able to produce quality services. So we say that productive public sector organization should be able to produce high quality services, and meaning they are able to do things right. And maybe if it is for the health sector, they are more effective, and that the outcomes would be better. That is one indicator of quality, positive outcome. And that is, I would consider part of public sector productivity, meaning to say the government is able, or the public sector organization is able to use properly the resources available to it, and produce the right or the quality service at the right time. You know? Maybe just the right cost, you're not reducing, but just at the right cost, you produce the expected outcome. So that is to be, you know, quality service, and that is part and parcel of public sector productivity.
Thank you very much. So I would like to invite Mr. Parham if you have any question to Ms. Mendoza based on her presentation.
Well, I would be very interested to hear how the public sector productivity program is going in the Philippines, and with a view to reducing corruption, because I had the impression that there was, you know, some efforts to reduce corruption in sort of local government areas, and looking at public sector productivity as a way of improving that sort of thing.
Ms. Mendoza, your question to his question.
Jose, can you repeat the question?
Okay.
Yeah, because it's quite.
I'd be interested in.
It's broken. Yeah.
Interested to hear how the efforts in the Philippines are going to
local government units.
Yeah, to spread public sector productivity and its measurement or its mindset through local government areas in particular, in order to improve or to reduce corruption and improve accountability.
Yeah, of course. We relate productivity and control of corruption, and currently the way we do that is, well, at least in the national government, it is the monitored in terms of the utilization of the budget. So we need to establish some standards to deliver a quality public service, and estimate the cost to deliver that level of quality. And of course, if the resources that would be used to produce a service is excessive, and yet the service is of poor quality, we can relate it to corruption. So corruption, as we defined, is actually when the sector has some leakages in the delivery of the service in part, and corruption also happens when people have to spend extra in order to secure government services. So inefficiency in government can lead to bribery, or sometimes inefficiency in the use of resources of government provides us an indication that probably public resources are going somewhere not in the intended programs and services of the government.
Thank you very much. So, Ms. Mendoza, I would like to
invite. Did I answer your question?
Yes. No, that's good. Thank you.
I think that will be a long journey. I think public sector productivity, even for the APO, is just like less than 20 years. But we are doing our best to support member countries' governments to improve productivity. And I think, as Ms. Mendoza presented, it is one way of addressing corruption in the country if we have productivity program in place. So, Ms. Mendoza, do you have any question for Mr. Parham based on his presentation? Do you have, Ms. Mendoza, do you have question to Mr. Parham? Okay,
Yeah,
I
okay.
think we
Actually,
have question
I
for
was not
him.
able to follow much the presentation, but I would be very
Okay.
interested if Dean can also discuss how to measure the productivity of the security sector, like military and police.
Yes, that's a good question. It's very difficult because it basically boils down to whether the public sector service is provided to individuals or to households or to businesses, or whether it's provided collectively. So if it's provided to individuals or households or businesses, we can count the number of services that are provided, and that gives us an output measure. But in the case of defence and security in general, these services are provided collectively. They're provided for the whole community. And so you can't get a meaningful output measure. So in the case of defence, you really have to go back to the old standard measure of of measuring output by the use of inputs, by expenditure. So yeah, it's too hard. Basically, is the short answer.
Okay.
Yeah, it
Thank you
is.
very
It
much.
is. There are actually some aspects of, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I remember when we had the national conference in Malaysia. That was a very good topic uh, in discussing public sector productivity. So we talk about even like immigration. So is it the number of illegal migrants, for example, caught and sent back home? So is it how we measure productivity performance of the agency? Or for the defense or border control, is it the number of fight with the other country or for border uh, securing border? Is it the number of fight you have with your neighboring countries in securing the border of your
Yeah.
country? So these are quite complex. I understand the question, and yeah. So anyway, I think we already exceeded our time. So let me just pose one last question. I think this is relating to all your presentations. So my last question is: so what are the challenges in defining or measuring public sector productivity?
Well, maybe if I could at least start with that. This is where I think it's important that we start with an individual organisation and do an internal exercise so that it can improve the measurement over time. And there are some technical areas, like in the relation to a capital measure, measuring assets, because a lot of public sector organisations don't have an asset register. They know how much they invest every year, but they don't really keep tabs on a depreciated net value of their assets. But those sorts of things can be improved with a little bit of work, a bit of effort. So capital is an area where we need to do some more work. And then the area of quality measurement, the quality of service and the effect on outcomes. And that's where you have to work closely with the organisation, sort out its objectives, define the areas, the desired outcomes, and find some quality indicators for those desired outcomes. So I think they're the major challenges in measurement.
Thank you very much for sharing your view to us. So, Ms. Mendoza, so what are the challenges you think in defining or measuring public sector productivity? Hello, Ms. Mendoza. Our last question, if you have your own views, so what are the challenges in defining or measuring public sector productivity?
Me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so as I mentioned in my earlier presentation, one challenge in defining public sector productivity is that there are many related concepts, and even among the experts, there is no consensus as to just one definition of public sector productivity. That's why I presented to you the technical narrow sense to the broader sense of public sector productivity, which is about the government improving its own productivity and the government providing a conducive environment to make the other sectors of the economy productive. When it comes to measuring productivity, when we use the output-input ratio, we find it difficult to quantify some of the outputs of government, just like what Dean already mentioned. But I think the bottom line is that at the end of the day, the question is whether or not the government was able to deliver the expected services and societal outcomes using in the most efficient, economical, effective, and ethical manner the public resources available to it. Yeah, that's my definition, and I hope there's a common view on that point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your insight to that question. Indeed, it's a very difficult and challenging in measuring or defining public sector productivity. So to our viewers, we have come to the end part of the series of P-Talks of the Asian Productivity Organization. So let me conclude by saying this, that while determining productivity of specific service has proven to be challenging, the APO publication that was presented by Mr. Parham investigated the productivity levels of selected public services, in this case, the health and education services. And it was concluded that given the ongoing changes, such as new approaches and systems taking place within the government, ongoing reform in the government, adoption of technologies to promote greater efficiency and effectiveness, among others, the APO will continue to support and recognize the role of the public sector in the overall national productivity performance so that it can produce results of higher value to the society. So this is the message that we would like to convey in today's session. So now we would like to invite Ms. Mendoza and Mr. Parham for the final word. Ms. Mendoza, please. Your final word. Ms. Mendoza, you have your final word now.
Okay, it's my turn. So may I just reiterate that productivity in the public sector is really very, very important because of its size, the scope of its activities, and its vital role in the development of a country. And it becomes even more important at this time when we are experiencing crisis. Because of the difficulties, we are expecting the public sector still expected to deliver all essential services and given scarce public resources, while at the same time it must capacitate itself to operate under the new normal in the context of increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. In order to provide agile response this time, and the only way it can do that is to introduce innovation. Hence, I think we are now proposing a new movement, which is innovative productivity in the public sector. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you very much. I like your innovative public sector productivity. So, Mr. Parham, your final word to our viewers.
Yes, well, thank you very much for your attention to those who have listened to what we've had to say. And I would encourage all of you to think about public sector productivity and its measurement. I think it provides a way of organising your thinking and sorting out objectives and how you go about them and dealing with ambiguity and getting a better allocation of resources. So I would really encourage people to think about it and to start applying it in their own organisations. But thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Parham, and thank you to both of you, Ms. Mendoza and Mr. Parham, for joining us in this P-Talk. And we would like to apologize to our viewers, as mentioned earlier, because of the typhoon that is passing through Manila now. So the connection is not that good, so I hope you will bear with us, and we apologize for the not so good connection we have with Ms. Mendoza. So with that, we would like to thank our viewers for watching this program. So thank you very much, and we would like to invite you again to please subscribe, stay tuned, and share the APO Productivity Talk in your respective countries. So thank you very much, and please stay tuned with our next session on P-Talk. Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.